Hi class, today we're going to talk about chapter 12, section 2, the Hyksos invade Egypt from the story of the world. In this video, we will review chapter 12.2, talk about the Middle Kingdom of Egypt and how it ends, and then the second intermediate period. So let's start with chapter 12, section 2 review. So chapter 12, section 2, the Hyksos invade Egypt. So Amenemhet's family is still ruling the Middle Kingdom of Egypt. His family is marked with really strong pharaohs. They didn't allow for rebellions. Egypt is very rich, very prosperous. Remember, we said last time that Amenemhet's family rules the 12th dynasty, and his family rules for 200 years. After Amenemhet's family begins the 13th dynasty, and the other families who are ruling in Egypt are very weak. They can't control the land, and they don't have an army. The Hyksos then invade. So the Hyksos are from Canaan. They're warlike nomads, and they moved to Egypt and they settled there. When they saw a chance, they attacked the pharaoh, and they had new weapons and things like that, and they defeat the soldiers. They capture the largest cities in Egypt, and they take the pharaoh's place. This ends the Middle Kingdom of Egypt. The Egyptians hated the Hyksos kings so much. They thought that they were uncivilized. However, the Hyksos stayed in Egypt for over 100 years. But then a rebellion happens. An Egyptian prince drives out the Hyksos, and the leader of this rebellion, whose name is Ahmose, becomes the new pharaoh. This begins the new kingdom of Egypt. So that's the end of your review on your chapter. Let's begin talking about the Middle Kingdom of Egypt and how it ends. So, review. So first intermediate period is marked, we talked about, with chaos. There's many pharaohs and governors ruling, and then Ahhotep II reunites Egypt. The Middle Kingdom of Egypt is really, really prosperous. He expands the borders. During this time, you have growth in art and literature and just cultural development as a whole. You have Senusret III building all of these fortresses down in Nubia and things like that. There are even pharaohs who are trying to build pyramids. And so the Middle Kingdom of Egypt is very prosperous under the 12th dynasty and Amenemhet's, the first family's rule. Here's a timeline that I showed you last video, just so again you can have a visual. Remember, intermediate period ends with Ahhotep II. We talked last time about the Middle Kingdom of Egypt, Dynasties 11 and 12, and then today we're going to get into the intermediate pyramid, or the second intermediate period, the 13th and 17th dynasties. So drought and a queen. The Nile floods decrease, and the pharaoh's power decreases as well. We've seen this happen before in the second dynasty. We've seen it happen before in the first intermediate period. It's kind of a common occurrence within ancient Egyptian history. So in the 12th dynasty, remember, Amenemhet's family ruling for 200 years. At the tail end of this is Senusret III. And remember, he's the strongest pharaoh during the Middle Kingdom of Egypt. He builds all those fortresses down in Nubia. Amenemhet III takes over, then Amenemhet IV, and then Queen Sobonefru. So Susan Wise Bauer says, a few details from the queen's reign have survived, but in ancient Egypt, a woman on the throne was a sign of serious palace trouble. Wasn't there like any other man or anyone to take over besides the queen? We don't know. We don't know much about this time, but the fact that a queen took over meant that there was something going on, that something wasn't right. The 12th dynasty ends with Queen Sobonefru, and it ends the Middle Kingdom of Egypt. So the 13th dynasty starts, and the 13th dynasty is marked by very weak, very obscure pharaohs, like you read about in your chapter, and this begins the second intermediate period. So the second intermediate period is from 1782 to 1570 BC. Susan Wise Bauer says, down in Nubia, the governors who watched over the southern lands for the crown began to act with more and more independence. The Nubian lands that Senusret III had trampled on with such ferocity during the 12th dynasty were easing out of the crown's grip. So that's down in Nubia. There was also trouble in the north as well. Ruins show that the border fortresses on the eastern border between the delta and the land of Asiatics were crumbling. The Asiatics were wandering Western Semitic nomads came into the delta in increasing numbers. So basically this is saying, here's Egypt. Down in the south, Nubia is easing out of the crown's grip. They're regaining their independence. The pharaohs in Egypt don't have enough power to keep them under their control. And then you have in the north people, Western Semitic nomads. Remember, Western Semites were from Canaan, and they are coming into Egypt in increasing number. So the 13th and 14th dynasties. So the second royal family is set up in the 14th dynasty, and they ruled alongside the 13th dynasty. So the 13th dynasty is ruling and the 14th dynasty is ruling. This was how things were in the first intermediate period as well, where you have multiple dynasties ruling at the same time. So they're in different cities. The 13th dynasty is in Ijtawe, and the 14th dynasty is east of the Nile. And both of these dynasties are incredibly weak. And this is when the Hyksos invade. So the 15th dynasty is what they rule. So their capital is in Avaris, which is, it's really hard to see, I'm sorry, right here. So that's the Hyksos and kingdom. It says this area right here. And then you have other dynasties down here. So Sheshi is a foreigner. He is known, they're known as the desert princes. Again, and he's a Hyksos. He organizes an army, he spreads his rule, and he destroys both the 13th and the 14th dynasties. So if that's a little confusing for you, I'm going to just clarify this. Did they invade suddenly and violently, or did they invade slowly? And the answer is they invaded slowly. They didn't just come in and say, oh, we're going to take over. The Hyksos had been in Egypt for a while, okay? They didn't just come in with their new cool weapons and defeat Egypt. They had settled there. They had been there for a while, and we know this because Semitic names appear in inscriptions in lists, and Avaris might have been largely Semitic already. So the city that they took over might have already been like mostly Semitic people. When the 13th and 14th dynasties became really, really weak, they were like, hey, here's our chance, here's their opportunity. So they did invade. I'm not saying that they're just kind of like, oh, and they took over. They did, in fact, invade and fight and take over. However, this was an invasion from within the country, not from outside, because they had already been there. So perception on how the Egyptians and the Hyksos viewed each other. So how the Egyptians viewed the Hyksos are, they thought that they were brutal. They destroyed Egypt. They ransacked the temples. They oppressed the country. The Hyksos viewed Egypt differently. They actually admired and adopted Egyptian culture and religion as their own because they liked it. They lived cordially with the government in Thebes, which we'll talk about in a second. So their perception of each other was very, very different. Manetho, who is like the Egyptian historian, who's the one who came up with all of these like dynasties and periods and things like that, says, by main force, they easily seized the country without striking a blow and having overpowered the rulers of the land. They then burned our cities ruthlessly, razed to the ground the temples of the gods. So again, just the Egyptians' perception was like they were just ruthless, brutal, destroyed things. So here's the state of Egypt at that time. So the Hyksos, ruling the 15th dynasty, alone did not have power. It kind of made it sound like that in the story of the world, but here's Avaris right here. And the 16th dynasty is ruling in the northwest, probably with permission from the Hyksos, and they're ruling in Ijtawe. And they're really weak and they're kind of insignificant, so don't worry too much about them. The 17th dynasty is ruling in Thebes down here. So again, like before, the 15th, 16th, and 17th dynasties are all ruling simultaneously. So just to quickly review what we've covered, we have the Middle Kingdom end, and then we have the second intermediate period start with the 13th dynasty and the 14th dynasty, and they're wiped out by the Hyksos, who is the 15th dynasty. So they crumble. So now we have 15, 16, and 17, and they're all ruling at the same time. So how did these two dynasties get along? Remember, the Egyptians hate the Hyksos. The Hyksos admire their culture, and they are allowing the 16th dynasty probably to be ruling. But I think this is really interesting. The 5th Hyksos king. So remember, the Hyksos are ruling the 15th dynasty. First king is Sheshi, then you have 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th. Apepi I sends a letter down south to the king of Thebes, Sequenere. And he says, "Get rid of the hippopotami at Thebes." The letter demands imperiously. "They roared all night. I can hear them all the way up here at Avaris, and their noise is ruining my sleep," which obviously they can't because it's miles and miles, hundreds of miles away. But Sequenere decided Apepi was picking a fight. And after getting this letter about like, "Hey, be quiet, your hippopotamus is annoying and I can't sleep," he decides, hey, this is him just, he's getting all up in my business. So he gathers his army and he heads north. In the battle, Sequenere is killed, brutally stabbed, hacked, and this doesn't turn into a war quite yet because he dies. His son, Kahmose, begins to plot revenge for his father's death. So again, Kahmose wants to avenge his father's death. However, he has some difficulties that lay ahead of him. He is trapped between the Hyksos in the north and the Nubians in the south. So the Nubians had been acting as an independent country because, again, the pharaohs in Egypt don't have enough power and ability to protect and rule their own country, let alone control another country. And so the Nubians are like, hey, we can kind of be our own country again. So they were. And they decide, we're going to make an alliance with the Hyksos. I think that's a smart move. So do you see this brown down here? Here's the kingdom of Kush, or the Nubians. Sorry, that's a terrible circle. And here's the Hyksos. And they're an alliance. And here in between, you have Egypt. So Kahmose is like, I would have to fight a two-front war. And he tries really hard. He like sends spies into Nubia so none of them can come up. And if you read his inscriptions and what he writes about this, he's very much prideful or like boastful. Like, I did all of these great and amazing things. Like, I did it. And it's like, did you really? And he didn't, because he might have had one successful raid into the Hyksos kingdom, but he died that year after only reigning for 3 years, so it didn't really amount to anything. So Kahmose's brother, after Kahmose dies, his brother Ahmose, who you read about in your chapter, takes the throne. He's still really, really young. His mom, Queen Ahhotep, then rules as regent, which means she is ruling on behalf of her son until her son is old enough to rule. So that's what's happening in Egypt. And then in Hyksos, in the Hyksos kingdom, which I guess, is in Egypt as well, but in the Hyksos kingdom, in the 15th dynasty, Apepi I finally dies. Remember, he was the 5th Hyksos king, and he ruled longer than any other Hyksos king ruled. He was a very powerful king, and when he dies, a weaker king comes to the throne. So she takes advantage of the fact that there's a transition in power in the 15th dynasty, and she begins her campaigns against the Hyksos. On her inscription, it's written, she's the one who has looked after her soldiers, has pacified Upper Egypt, and expelled her rebels, which is really high praise for a woman in ancient Egypt at this time period. She is buried with a ceremonial axe and 3 medals, which you can see here. So she did a lot for her country to get rid of the Hyksos. So when Ahmose is old enough to take the throne, he receives this head start from his mom. So by the 20th year of his reign, it still takes a really long time. By the 20th year of his reign, he battles his way all the way up to Avaris, and he drives the Hyksos out of Egypt. So what happened? Obviously, there were a lot of battles that happened when Ahmose went to expel the Hyksos. Avaris, their city, is just completely sacked. The palace is flattened, and other traces of Hyksos occupation just completely removed. The Egyptians did not want people to remember that this other people group, these uncivilized people, had enough power to come in and rule them and take over part of their country for over 100 years. And so again, a lot of evidence of them even being there, their occupation has just completely been wiped out. So then where did the Hyksos go? There's no sign that a mass slaughter happened. Semitic names also don't show up on the servants list during this time. So theory goes, then okay, then they didn't take them as slaves or servants. There's also a theory that maybe a mass exodus happened, that they just said, okay, you guys can just leave, just go, and they left. Now, little side note here, there are scholars that link the Israelites and their exodus to the Hyksos and their potential exodus. I personally don't think they're the same people, even though the Hyksos were Western Semitic, right? They're from Canaan, that region, as well as the Israelites. But the time period of the Exodus is different, and so I don't think the Hyksos were the Israelites. So now that the Hyksos have been expelled and are gone from Egypt, this is the end of the second intermediate period. Ahmose is named the first king of the 18th dynasty, and this begins the new kingdom of Egypt. There's a new phase of building that happens. There's peace, prosperity, art, and literature, and we will talk about that next week. And so I hope you enjoyed learning about the end of the Middle Kingdom and the second intermediate period and how that ended. Thank you for watching. I will see you next time. Bye.